needed clarity and bring members together, members of Congress together with people that knew information but didn't like the members of Congress. And so as the current chair of the Tax enough already, this is a topic of readiness to should be to every member of Congress. And we know there's a Capitol Police investigation, and I saw something else from the FBI. But, you know, bring in representatives from different groups that they'll shed light on. Shed light.
Has there been anyone who's put the touch on back on but not pursue it?
I mean, I think the reason we have the people that are, you know, members of Congress that are going to participate is because all of us have made inquiries. We've been provided an opportunity to get briefings from different folks, House admin, and Sergeant Arms, but it's such an important and delicate issue. So it would be good to bring in some people that can shed more light than we've got except before. See, that's the thing. I don't know how seriously they're treating it. I think they realize that it is serious, but we just don't have enough information to know exactly how serious. And that's one of the reasons we're doing this today.
Had you expected questions to be answered a lot earlier than this?
Most of us didn't find out anything until earlier this year when it was indicated there was an investigation. From a law enforcement position, I've been shocked that the only charge had to do with the loan fraud, since there's so many other issues at stake. And it just appears to be a lot that may be crimes, and we're not sure if they're being pursued as such, but it certainly sounds like they're trying to be pursued.
What do you think is the most striking revelation over the last few months regarding something that you'd like to see more information on?
Well, it's hard to put my finger on one thing. I mean, this whole episode, I mean, it's like there's a new monthly revelation each month this year, but it gets stranger and stranger. And so, you know, Sarah, we're going to be asking questions and getting into things. I don't know, do you have a favorite shop piece of information?
Well, I would think the breach, the idea of a breach in Congress would be probably the most, if that's proven, would probably be the most disturbing.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's something that you thought of, if other members of Congress
Well,
discussed.
that would be potentially the most disturbing, but another matter of great concern to me is the amount of issues that these people, I mean, members of Congress have their information compromised, or at least being available to people that they don't know, they never approved, they didn't hire. So, yeah, there's just so much that's disturbing about all of this. And I guess one of the things that's a bit disturbing is why there's not more concern on the Hill about the whole matter. I know there's been plenty of reports about Awan's wife in Pakistan, eventually coming back. She wasn't charged on it, but this business we'll know about today has been so good.
Hey, Jerry,
You put
can you watch that Twitter and just see
information
the live?
potentially from lots of members of Congress on there, see, I don't know what they want to do, or if it's too little or too much, because, it just keeps being an ongoing investigation, and, members need to know more. That's one of the great things about having different caucuses on Capitol Hill. The caucuses can make different inquiries and get facts out for more folks to know. I don't know what their amount of interest or concern is. They say they are concerned and there's an investigation. But let's get this out where others will know.
On that then, just among rank and file, how much pressure did you see for a formal hearing, if any, was anybody open on that?
No, not so much. It just, we've got, there were 4 of us that have been asking, getting briefings, and we just decided, what, let's have a meeting today, a caucus meeting, and get some answers from representatives from groups that would know more. That's what this is about. See, I can't get a read from the Capitol Police. They're very methodical law enforcement. Like we were taught in the military, you just follow your orders and you don't show any emotion or about your superiors' concerns or lack of concern. Just follow your orders and do what you're told. And do what you're told about doing.
Was there,
Except for here. Well, I don't know. There hasn't been one. I'm not a chair, and I doubt that I ever will be a chair. So, that's what you get when you're a little too outspoken for your leadership. So, this is the way we get. This is the available way we have of getting down information that will be helpful to them. And he was one of the guys that's been pushing the hardest for information. we'll go ahead and get started. In the tradition of the former chair of the Taxed Enough Already caucus, Tim Hulskamp, we're having a meeting today to bring out information that may be of interest or assistance to members of Congress. Today we have members of Congress. Here with me right now is Congressman Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, but getting here as quickly as they can is Congressman Jim Jordan and Congressman Ron DeSantis, and we may have a couple of others that they're able to join us. And the tradition that Tim Hulskamp set was, this was a caucus that would have members sit down with representatives of different groups, organizations, companies, entities, and discuss an important topic of the day. And by virtue of coming together and discussing issues, members of Congress ended up with a whole lot more information than they'd had before. We hope what is discussed at this event today will be helpful to other members as they continue their work in their offices. I certainly have already learned a great deal that I did not know about our information technology workers and abilities and what is potentially at risk. So we're hoping that what we discussed today will be helpful to members in knowing what was at risk and what possibly is still at risk by virtue of an IT worker named Awan, since he is now under indictment for a bank fraud case. But we have concerns about some of the other items. Were there other crimes committed? There certainly seemed to be important issues that were raised. Want to introduce our guests at this time. Here on my right is the chair of, or the president of Judicial Watch. And just a word about Judicial Watch. In my opinion, Judicial Watch has been not only a beacon of light to show people on Capitol Hill the way to go, but also has been a spotlight to shine light on matters that need to be known that have been unknown. I think in this little 228-year experiment in self-government, if we don't get information out to those who make decisions in this government, then we are in more risk than most people realized. In prior times, before the ban on specific line item legislation or earmarks, routinely Congress would get information from reluctant offices by threatening to cut funds or actually cutting funds. I know one of my distant predecessors, the late, great Charlie Wilson from Lufkin, Texas, was quite good on appropriations about making sure if a governmental office did not properly provide information or act as Congress felt appropriate, there were repercussions to their checkbook, to their funding, and that usually got the desired result. Since that has not been happening in recent years, we're finding more and more government offices more reluctant to give us the information we have sought. But we also may be joined, as I said, by couple, at least two more members of Congress, and we appreciate my office wanted to stream this, and can't thank Judicial Watch enough for all the help in doing that. Also wanted to give Congressman Scott Perry a chance to make an opening comment.
I think that's mounted there. Thank you, Representative Gomert. And in the tradition of of other proceedings here in the House, I'm going to begin with an opening statement so you can see where I'm headed and codify my thoughts. And I want to thank everybody for taking the time out of their schedules to be here today. When I heard of some of the initial facts and findings of this situation, it didn't quite fit together, and I felt at least that something wasn't right. I thought surely this will make sense as we will get to the bottom of the investigation. The problem is a proper investigation into the series of events doesn't seem to be taking place to me, and I think many Americans feel the same way. Now, generally, I'm not one to read prepared statements, but the gravity and seriousness of what we are here to discuss necessitates it so that I make sure I'm accurate in recounting the details. I'd like to focus my attention on the storage and transfer of data by Mr. Awan and the unattended laptop found by Capitol Police. Here's what we know. The House Office of Inspector General tracked the Awan's network usage and found that a massive amount of data was flowing from the networks. Over 5,700 logins by the 5 Awan associates were discovered on a single server within the House. The server of the Democratic Caucus Chairman, then Rep. Xavier Becerra of California, 5,400 appear unauthorized. All right, he is now the Attorney General of California. According to the reports, the Becerra server was actually housing the entirety of a clear violation, entirety of the servers of all the member offices that employed Imran or his associates, all of it, the entirety. It's a clear violation of House policy. This means that up to 40 or more members of Congress had all of their data moved out of their office server or out of their cloud storage system and onto the Becerra server without their knowledge or consent. The House OIG reported their findings to the Speaker's office, Democratic leadership, and the House Administration Committee, as well as the House Sergeant-at-Arms and Capitol Police in late September and early October of 2016, and Capitol Police began a criminal investigation into Imran Awan and his associates at that time. Capitol Police determined that the image they required Imran to provide was falsified, likely with deliberate attempt to conceal the activities that they knew were against House policy and the law. These facts, standing alone, indicate a substantial security threat at the least, but the events don't end there. A laptop was recovered in a phone booth in the Rayburn office building after midnight on April 6, 2017. According to Capitol Police report, reviewing the bag recovered in that phone booth contained the following items. Number one, a Pakistani ID card with the name Mohammed Ashraf Awan. Number two, a copy, not the original, of a driver's license with the name Imran Awan. Number three, a copy, front and back, of his Congressional ID. Number four, an Apple laptop with the home screen initials Rep. DWS. Number five, composition notebooks with the notes handwritten saying attorney-client privilege, that's in quotes, and possibly discussing case details below. Number six, loose letters addressed to the U.S. Attorney of D.C., the District of Columbia, discussing the apparent owner of the bag being investigated. The bag was recovered after Imran was banned from accessing the House IT network, but not before he was ultimately fired from Rep. Wasserman Schultz. Capitol Police banned Imran Awan and his associates from the House network on February 2nd, 2017. Just remember when the investigation started. Wasserman Schultz then fired Awan on July 25th after learning about his arrest, so 6 months later. Despite the threat of consequences to the police chief if a member equipment was not returned, the police continued their investigation of the computer. Representative Wasserman Schultz has hired an attorney to represent her interests in the matter. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I don't have any prosecutorial experience. I don't have any expertise in information technology, and I'm not going to claim any specialized investigative journalist skills. But I have been fortunate enough to be placed in front of individuals that do have particularized knowledge in these areas to ask questions that need to be answered. I hope today sheds light onto enough of what we know thus far, full well knowing that there is much more to be uncovered, to initiate a true investigation into whether U.S. taxpayer money was misspent, access to sensitive information was misused and or stolen, if these individuals are going to be held accountable for what happened, and if procedures have been instituted to prevent a situation like this from ever happening again. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Mr. Goen.
Thank you. And I need to finish introducing people who are guests here to provide information. We've been joined by Congressman Jim Jordan, and I mentioned earlier would be here. But we figured if we're going to get anywhere on discussing this issue, we ought to have the person that's done more investigation into the Awan family and the potential security breach that occurred as a result of their actions. And that is a reporter for the Daily Caller, Luke Rosiak, and we're really pleased you could be here, Luke. We appreciate all the digging you've done when nobody else seemed to be digging many, many months ago. And and Andy, okay, that's fine, okay. Also been joined by Congressman Andy Biggs. But then we also have another guest here to share information, Pat Sowers, with Shared Systems Administrator, but he is here in his personal capacity. He's done IT work, and we figured he would be invaluable as matters came up, as pointed out by Luke Rosiak or Tom Fitton, that you could tell us things we don't know. I'm constantly learning things in my own office about IT matters I didn't know. And I got to say, this whole matter here involving the Awans has raised a lot of questions in our own office that we've learned a great deal about. So Luke, Tom, Pat, we appreciate y'all all being here today. Let me ask Congressman Jordan or Congressman Biggs, you have anything to say before we start this meeting of the Taxed Enough Already caucus? All right, good. Well, I think Scott's was so great that was good enough for all of us. Well, at this time, I'll begin with questioning, and it seems like a fair way to go is we take turns asking questions, and we will do that now. And I'd like to start, Luke, anything you would like to say to start the information flowing about the Awans? Okay, please, by all means. Yeah, is that button pushed?
Good thing we have an IT guy sitting next to me. It really helps. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the caucus. My name is Luke Rosiak. I'm an investigative reporter for the Daily Caller News Foundation. I've been an investigative reporter covering problems in the federal government for 10 years. Back in February 2017, I read a mostly unnoticed story in Politico about unnamed House IT staffers being suspected of abusing their positions. I was the first reporter to identify them by name, and when I ran them through public record searches, I found long-running anomalies suggestive of problems more serious in nature than what I first expected. Even then, I thought members would be surprised to find that rogue staffers were doing things without their knowledge and would swiftly condemn them and work with prosecutors. That's not what happened. Since then, I've written 40 stories on the topic. The two core issues here are ones I know are important to members of both parties. The first is cybersecurity. Government agencies, political parties, and private industry have repeatedly seen in recent years the cyber threats we face at the hands of bad actors and the harm that can come from not providing robust defenses and swift responses. The second is oversight of government procurement. Congress is tasked with ensuring that trillions of appropriated dollars are legally and responsibly spent. For well over a year now, House officials have been in possession of documentation showing that the House's own purchase orders for office equipment contain misstatements of the true cost of equipment, seemingly for the purposes of evading congressional rules and scrutiny. Some of this equipment appears to be missing. Similarly, for more than a year now, House officials have been in possession of evidence that House servers were accessed thousands of times without authorization, and large quantities of data were being funneled off the network. The available facts, which I've learned from House officials, government records, including police reports, contemporaneous court filings, and House disbursement records, as well as witness interviews, suggest significant violations of House policies and worse. I've been asked by many people to help them understand the basic facts in this case, and I appreciate the opportunity to put forth this information today. There's been substantial misinformation in the public realm about this matter, both maximizing and minimizing it. As some have been quick to point out, random internet users have speculated wildly. At the same time, some members have claimed this investigation is about nothing more than bank fraud, which is at least as incorrect. This information in both directions has flourished as a result of an extraordinary level of silence from official channels surrounding the falsified billing and cybersecurity breaches on Capitol Hill. There are reasons to suspect that this secrecy is not because vigorous action is being taken behind the scenes. The bank fraud charges 2 former staffers are currently facing were ancillary to the initial investigation, which included over $100,000 of missing equipment in just one member office. At the time the investigation began, the family was working for 45 members of Congress. This investigation into falsified invoices and missing equipment led to the uncovering of cybersecurity breaches that may be unprecedented in scope on Capitol Hill and could have placed member and constituent data at risk. In addition, there are indications that millions of dollars were paid to what may have been ghost employees. To date, no one has been charged with any of these apparent violations, and there are indications that the cyber breach has not been taken seriously. I also want to briefly note a story I published around noon today. I've obtained a Pakistani lawsuit in which Henna Alvi, the wife of Imran Awan, has turned against him and filed fraud charges against him there. So even as people are saying, is this all some kind of partisan thing, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense because these guys were suspected of stealing things from Democrats. There's not really anything partisan about it on the face of it. People are saying, you know, is it partisan? Is it somehow Islamophobia? This is the latest evidence that wherever this guy goes, we see indications of red flags. So again, we have a filing from his own wife accusing him of making violent threats if he doesn't cooperate. And I'll read briefly from a passage. I uploaded those documents today. They were obtained directly from Lahore High Court in Pakistan. So Henna Alvi filed legal papers saying, my husband committed fraud along with the offense of polygamy. Furthermore, the respondent threatened the complainant of dire consequences. He also threatened to harm the lives of family of the complainant if she intervenes. So that brings us up to date on this continuing investigation, which, as you said, Mr. Chairman, it just seems more and more developments all the time. So again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for this opportunity, and I welcome all your questions.
Thank you for those open comments. Spit, do you have any statement you'd like to provide?
Yeah, I have some informal comments to make. First of all, thank you, Congressman Gomert. Thank you, Congressman Gomert, and the other members present for taking the initiative on this topic. It's clear, unfortunately, the leadership of both parties isn't terribly interested in highlighting and exposing the soft underbelly of the maladministration of House resources that has been exposed by the Awan brothers scandal. And I'd like just to highlight some of the issues I think that we ought to be thinking about and talking about and questions we need to be asking. And the answers may not be what people suspect they might be, but there's no harm in asking the questions. And you're not being diligent if you don't answer the rather obvious questions as we proceed with this investigation. Now, for those of you who don't know, Judicial Watch is a nonprofit educational foundation that uses the tools available to us under law to find out what the government's up to. And one of the challenges we have initially with the Awan brothers scandal, in which there's a significant public interest, is that the Freedom of Information Act doesn't apply to Congress. And I understand there are constitutional concerns about making it apply broadly to Congress, but one of the issues here is about the administration of the House and how employees are handled, how equipment's handled, and the basic running of the operations of the House of Representatives. And I think that's the sort of area that at least can be covered under a Freedom of Information Act type law that would protect the prerogatives of Congress constitutionally in terms of the speech and debate clause and obviously the First Amendment rights of Americans to petition their members without fear of having their names being brought up all over the media. So I think that's something that's got to be front and center, the lack of transparency available under law to American citizens about what the people's house is up to. But given the state of the law, it seems incumbent upon the leadership of the House to make sure that the organs of the House that are charged with policing the administration of the House are doing the work necessary to reassure the American people that the members are stewards, or proper stewards of taxpayer resources. And I don't think that's been done in this case. I'm not aware of any official hearing by the House into this burgeoning scandal that has implicated dozens of members, or either innocently or maybe not so innocently, and has led to criminal charges. And there's strong evidence, as Luke has reported on, about malappropriation of government resources, taxpayer resources. And this needs to be front and center, it seems to me, for the House. You know, I recall, I've been around Washington, I don't want to admit to this, long enough to remember the last time the rules of the House were brazenly violated by a party. And that was during the check kiting scandal back in 1994. And those where the rules were violated, you know, there was no policing, and it led to the Democrats losing control of the House. And in this case, ironically, the Democrats are most directly affected, but it's the Republican majority that is charged with making sure the rules are being followed. And it doesn't seem to me like they're doing the work necessary to reassure the American people that they take potential criminal activity by staff members of the House and potential hiding of that criminal activity by members seriously. The national security issue is something that is obvious front and center here. There's enough evidence to ask questions about it. And my concern is that the Justice Department is afraid to raise the issue initially, because this is essentially what happened. I don't know if we've had a summary of the scandal, but a family of individuals, Pakistani in origin, who are naturalized American citizens, I think all of them, have been working in the House for a large number of Democrats, in violation seemingly of rules about how employees are managed by offices. Essentially, you had 4 or 5 people working for 40 House offices. That's not the way it's supposed to work. You can't check to see what the individuals are doing work-wise, and it led to breaches of secure information, evidently, all over the place, at least on the House Democratic side. And so since then, we've had evidence that they were in contact with some Pakistani officials, and there were aliases used, all sorts of red alerts in terms of a national security impact. And of course, the data being moved in large quantities also suggests something wrong. And evidently, to even raise that question is something that's controversial. And it seems to me that ought to be a basic question. It could be something as simple as a Pakistani family, an American family of Pakistani origin, took advantage of lax oversight by House administrators to steal money, to steal equipment, or to use it as a place or a vehicle for which to defraud banks. It could be as simple as that. But frankly, when it comes to political crimes with a political component, I fear the Justice Department is going to fear to tread. And it may not, because of the political nature of what went on, they're not going to push the House. We've already seen pushback from Debbie Wasserman Schultz against law enforcement over her prerogatives, her office's prerogatives here. And I fear the Justice Department is going to be fearful of raising these issues with the House for fear of embarrassing the leadership of both parties. And that's something we need to kind of push the Justice Department on, that they don't undercharge or under-investigate this for fear of the consequences that will happen if they push further and find something that no one wants to find, which is a national security threat at our breasts here in the House. And of course, there's this basic issue of who's watching the store. Hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars have gone missing through equipment. People, when they communicate with their House members, often communicate the most private information, as sensitive as anything the IRS has or anything that your health doctor, your health care provider has. If you've got a problem with your Social Security or your VA benefits, you provide your Social Security information, you provide other sensitive personal data and confidential health data and data about your situation, and that material could be on your members' servers. All that could have been breached here. So not only is the confidentiality of the House proceedings at issue here, but the privacy interest of who knows how many Americans have been breached as a result of this lackadaisical attitude. And secondly, we've got the issue of whether or not the process for accountability here is working. And I shouldn't say secondly, and maybe seventhly. Where are the committees? Where's the House Administration Committee? I'm pleased that the leadership of both parties, when they were briefed by the House Office of Inspector General, said we got to bring the FBI in. But does that mean you shut down your investigation? You don't hold members to account who, when warned about potential criminal activity, continue to place these staffers, or at least one staffer in the case of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, in a position where they might be able to continue criminal activity and still be able to harm the taxpayer and other House members and House staffers? This is a mighty serious issue. And I tell you, I don't know whether the alleged DNC hacks and some of the hacks we've seen recently are tied to the Pakistani family crime ring that we have found here in the House. But to the extent Mr. Mueller is doing a competent job, it seems to me he'll want to at least ask some questions to see if there's an intersection between the hacks of Democratic officials, including Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and this and the Awan family crime ring. And again, I don't know, it could be all very easy answers to the questions I'm raising, but I don't think there's an easy answer to the fact that this House has failed to police itself, and it's left itself susceptible to being defrauded by crooks. And you've got to wonder, is this just the tip of the iceberg? I know Republicans have made much of the fact that this is a Democratic issue. Given the way the rules are, who knows? Are there similar situations in the House staffing? I don't know. On the Republican side, I don't know. And this is why it's important that you all push this.
Thank you very much. You touched on so many important issues, and you're right not to say second, because you had so many good points. And let me just ask, Pat, do you have any opening comments you want to make?
Thank you. Just like to thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be a part of this conversation. I've had some conversations with Luke over the last few months, and I think he covered this quite well. My presence here is to hopefully lend my experience over the last 13 years on the Hill as an administrator to answer some questions and clarify what was right and what was wrong.
Okay, thanks so much, Pat. And I'll start off and appreciate those opening comments from everyone. Tom, you'd mentioned potential breaches of secured information, and there does get to be a lot of confusion sometimes. I know that I've read in some articles that people have talked about there were no breaches of classified information, even if you have a member of the House who is on Intel and has access to all kinds of classified information. They said, well, no classified information had been breached. But I'd understood somewhere, and that's fine, but I'd understood somewhere that a former intelligence head that ended up being found guilty of leaking classified or providing classified information to a person who was not entitled to have it. I understood that may have been a calendar that had notes in it that may have pertained to something classified. We know that there are countries and companies, entities around the world that would pay a lot of money to have access to some members' calendars, to their emails, see who they're meeting with, see what they're saying about those meetings. That could be very valuable information. But I had an interesting seat back when William Jefferson was being investigated, and this issue of classified versus privilege came up. I think the privilege, Mr. Fitton, you talked about with regard to information provided to us by constituents and others. is so critical. We cannot ever do proper oversight over any executive branch, no matter what administration it is, unless we're able to keep that information privileged. So it was very important to me because I was complaining at that time William Jefferson was being investigated about damage that Director Mueller was doing to the FBI. And I had FBI agents around the country that had provided information. He had no right to ever know who those people were. And yet, one evening, without notifying the House, he got a warrant, came in and searched Congressman Jefferson's office and seized all the documents, every thumb drive, everything that could contain information. And I was asked to sit in meetings between House counsel and the Attorney General's office and discuss, and there was a lot of anger because apparently for over 200 years, if law enforcement needed information from the House, to keep that not classified but privileged information privileged and not gained by the FBI or the executive branch when it wasn't needed. And the courts ended up verifying this, and the FBI acted wrong. They have to first go to the Speaker of the House. Don't know what you do if the Speaker's implicated, but and the House counsel would then go seize that congressman's information. The Speaker apparently had that right. And then House counsel would go through and determine what was applicable under the warrant and what was privileged and should not be turned over. And Mueller's effort back then to say, oh, no, we'll have a Chinese firewall, we'll have DOJ personnel that will go through everything, and they just won't be part of the prosecution team, and they'll tell the prosecution team what they can have. The High Court said that's not good enough. That is too important of a privilege. So it is important that information be protected. And I'd like to go to Luke. What time did Imran Awan and his associates begin working for members of the U.S. House from your investigation?
Imran began working for members, I believe, including Xavier Becerra and Robert Wexler. Before he was a citizen, I believe he would have been about 20 years old, which would have been about 2000, 2001. And he was working for a company called Inter-America, which is now iConstituent. So after doing a couple years as a contractor, he went off and started his own shingle, basically, and started working as a W-2 employee in 2004.
Have you been able to find out what kind of security background check there was when he was not a citizen?
I don't know what kind of practices were in place back then or what that private company did. But from there, the pattern is that every time they reached the pay cap, which is a staffer can't make more than a new member of the family would join the payroll. So this potentially fits the pattern of a ghost employee scheme where they're using someone else's identity as a conduit for payments that otherwise would not be allowed. So you have members added every couple years or every year, family members rather, joining the payroll in 2004, 2005, 2006, until you've got him, his wife, his brother's wife, who's Ukrainian born, and his other brother, and then their best friend, Raul Abbas, who worked at McDonald's.
Well, but if the family all had great information technology experience and training, then that could be okay. What did your investigation reveal about family members' training and ability in the IT area?
The Washington Post reported last month, quoting Imram's lawyer, that these guys were provided on-the-job training by Imram, which could potentially be a rule violation because these other members were working for, these other family members were working for different congressional offices. So Imram shouldn't have been accompanying them on their duties at all, to say nothing of the fact that if you're being trained on the job and you're 20 years old, like his younger brother was, $160,000 is a lot of money. So you also have other examples. For example, a member, Kristen Sinema, fired one of these guys several years ago for incompetence. So you go through the background, and there were a few signs here and there that these guys didn't know what they're doing, but only a few members seemed to object to that fact or seemed to notice it.
I think one of your stories reported that one of the family got his experience at McDonald's.
That's right.
Yeah, okay. Well, I want to yield to my friend Congressman Perry.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Gohmert. This is for Luke, I think. As I stated in my opening statement, on April 6th of 2017 of this year, Capitol Police found an unattended laptop in the phone booth in Rayburn House Office Building. With the laptop was a Pakistani ID card, a copy of Mr. Awan's driver's license, a copy of his Congressional ID staff badge, letters to the U.S. Attorney, and a notebook marked attorney-client privilege. It's my understanding that this information is part of the Capitol Police report. Is that correct, as you know it?
That's right.
All right. And you've seen the report?
Yes.
Okay. Is there additional evidence to show that Mr. Imran purposely left this laptop where he did?
No, there's not. We don't know what his intentions would be. His lawyers have said that he accidentally left it there, but it's a small room and it's a lot of seemingly pretty important and carefully curated equipment.
Right.
And to leave that and walk away, I mean, people can draw their own
Does the
inferences.
House have surveillance tapes of the office buildings that you know of?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay. Now, a month later in May, Ms. Wasserman Schultz asked Capitol Police Chief Matthew Verderosa some pointed questions at Legislative Branch Appropriations Subcommittee hearing regarding a laptop. I've watched the footage. The representative seems pretty upset. She talks about consequences if the laptop is not returned. Based on your research and knowledge of the investigation, do you believe that the laptop in question belongs to Representative Wasserman Schultz, or is it the same one?
It is the same one in that here. So this is, as you said, it was found by the Capitol Police in April. The following month, she used an Appropriations Committee hearing to make those threats against the Capitol Police, saying in the hypothetical that it was a member's laptop and the member had lost it. In July, she offered a different story, saying that it was Imram's laptop and she had never seen it. But she was, she said, I believe it was purchased with her MRA, so it was a government property. Now, I was in court on Friday for the arraignment of the wife here, and Imram had a status hearing, and this was about bank fraud, but the lawyer stood up and said, we feel, quote, very strongly that we want to block the government from using the hard drive that was found in that backpack in the phone booth. So that appears to be, as well, the same computer at issue, which did have the username rep.dws. So while Wasserman Schultz has invoked the constitutional privileges that the chairman spoke about, you also have invocation of attorney-client privilege from Imran Awan's side. And that's interesting because he hadn't been charged with any crimes at that time, but he appears to be saying, because there was that notebook that you mentioned that had scribbled inside the notebook something about attorney-client privilege, that therefore this laptop can't be used as evidence in any way.
So it's unclear at this point whose laptop it was, right? It had her initials on the screensaver, what have you. It's either one or the other, right? You would think it's either one person or the other.
Right.
Either way, why would he, assuming he left it, why would he do that? Mr. Fitton, do you know? I mean, you're an attorney. I'm not.
I'm not an attorney.
You're not? Okay. I thought you were. All right. Any idea why he would do that?
I'm not sure I want to speculate about that, but it was clear that whatever Wasserman Schultz believed was on that laptop, she certainly didn't want anyone to see.
Now, it's also, I think, and maybe you can confirm this for me, that while Representative Wasserman Schultz has hired a private attorney to negotiate with investigators for the release of this laptop in particular, whether it's hers or not, we don't know, and she agreed to allow a scan of the laptop, and you have a document, a copy of the document showing the image of the hard drive of this laptop was provided to Imran Awan. Is that correct? He got a copy of it?
Yeah, so prosecutors have it, and he had a copy that he got under discovery, but it remains to be litigated whether prosecutors are going to be allowed to use that laptop as part of an ongoing criminal case.
So Mr. Awan and his attorney have an image of the entire hard drive from the computer that somehow he either bought with taxpayer money on behalf of the Democrat conference or it belongs to Representative Wasserman Schultz, and he, Mr. Awan, has a copy of everything on that laptop right now.
Yes, and it's worth noting that I believe both Wasserman Schultz and Imram are in agreement that this is a government laptop, and of course he was banned in February from accessing the House network. So this is a fired employee who there was concern that he should not have access to, government information, and yet he, as you say, was given this copy and has it right now.
Now, we don't know exactly where, I mean, the server information might be on this laptop, it might not be on this laptop, right? I mean, is it possible that the server information that I discussed in my opening statement of the 40 members of Congress that were taken or imaged or sent, you know, were transferred, could they be on this laptop?
I don't have any knowledge of whether he would have copied over the server onto the laptop, but Wasserman Schultz invoking speech and debate clause would suggest that there is legislative information on that laptop.
Including maybe not necessarily classified information, but certainly sensitive information.
Could be.
Not only of the Democratic caucus, but also of individual constituents, et cetera. Their information might be all throughout that and now might be in Mr. Awan's hands.
Right.
You know, just a few points. We've seen this game with Mrs. Clinton's emails and her false statements about whether they were classified or not.
Right.
And so we cannot take at face value there was no
I understand,
classified
and I agree with you,
information
right,
here.
yeah.
And when it comes to privileges, no one doubts that there may be implicated privileges here, the speech or debate clause or attorney-client, but there's no privilege that can't be waived. And you can waive your privileges. It doesn't mean you lose your privileges, but in certain instances you may think the public interest overcomes the need to assert the privilege here. And in the case of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, I don't think she may have made material available to her credit without asserting the privilege. Doesn't mean she's waived anything yet. But I think members involved and implicated in this scandal should think about whether they need to assert the privilege just for the sake of asserting it. You don't lose anything by waiving a privilege. The privilege is still there. You're just waiving it for the purpose of the public.
I also
interest
find
here.
it somewhat astounding that this information is being provided to this individual being investigated for bank fraud under attorney-client privilege, which would literally be all the information of multiple members of Congress, including sensitive information, including calendar or whereabouts information, at a time where Steve Scalise was, and the entire Republican baseball team was found out on a field, and thank goodness the security detail was there. It could have been a lot worse. But the point is that there's a reason that information is sensitive. Let me move on to another topic, though. On July 22nd, WikiLeaks published over 44,000 DNC emails. In 2 email chains, it is revealed that Imran Awan knew Ms. Wasserman Schultz's username and password. Specifically, in exchange on May 4th of 2016, Garrett Bonsky of the DNC asked for Ms. Wasserman Schultz's username and password. And it is revealed in that email that Mr. Awan knew the username and password, which is certainly automatically, we all know that's a violation of policy. But do we know for certain if the password that the DNC office of the chair deputy director, Garrett Bonsky, was for the House account or for her DNC account? Do we know that?
I believe that was for her personal iPad, which I would assume would have the DNC emails for
personal
her.
As opposed to official. Official would be the conference, the caucus, the House of Representatives. Personal would be personal / or DNC political.
It was an iPad that she used as her primary device. I don't know what account she had hooked into it.
So if it is not official, then it is not a violation of House policy, right? If it's, yes, sir, go ahead.
I can interject that as a member of Congress, you are permitted to receive your official communication on a campaign device. So if it was a device that was paid for by the campaign, it is quite possible that her official emails, calendar, and things like that were on the device.
But is it still a violation of policy for the username and password to be circulated among other individuals?
I would assume yes.
Okay. Is it reasonable then to assume that he had full access, if he had access to her username and password, that he had full access to all of her emails?
Absolutely.
Let me finish up here, Lily.
Sure.
If he had full access to all of those emails in the account, and including the DNC stuff, is it reasonable to assume, since he moved all the other stuff off-site, right? He literally moved all the other stuff off-site onto the shadow server, the Xavier Becerra server. Is it safe to assume that he could have, if he wanted to, moved all the DNC data off-site as well?
I don't know about his access to the DNC, but
anything on that machine?
Correct.
On that device, right? Now, he was banned. The investigation started on July of 2016. He was banned from House IT on February of 2017. Representative Wasserman Schultz didn't relieve him of his duties here until July 25th of 2017. Is there any reason anybody can think of, knowing all that information, she would, and the sensitivity of that, what are the potential reasons why she would have kept him on, knowing all those things were occurring?
I can't think of a reasonable one.
Anybody else?
Well, you could think of corrupt reasons. You could think of non-corrupt reasons.
Well, why don't you give me any of the reasons you can think of?
That she fears, in terms of the corruption issue, embarrassment for having employed this person, and firing him would be an admission that she should have exercised better oversight. Concern that there was information about her as a result of her access to her systems and her colleagues' systems that would be embarrassing, and that therefore he had leverage over her. The non-corruptive reasons, although troubling, would be what she said, that she had an ideological concern, that she thought he was being targeted because of his Muslim beliefs, and therefore she was going to put the public at risk to make a political point. There are corrupt and non-corrupt reasons. I don't think any of them are sufficient or persuasive to keep him employed.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Jordan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, gentlemen, a little bit ago, Mr. Rosiak said he didn't want to speculate, but that's kind of what I actually want you to do, and give me your best guess as professional. I mean, you think about this story. You got one family, Mr. Awan and 4 of his relatives and a friend. They work for dozens and dozens of Democrats over a 10-year time frame. Most of them don't have any real IT experience. They work this 10 years. They don't really do that much work. There's a bunch of ghost employees. They had access to congressional servers with authorization to move things around. They did all that. They had the password to Debbie Wasserman Schultz. All this is going on. Then an investigation starts. Capitol Hill police say on February 2nd that they bar him from any more access. Then the wife flees a month later, takes some money, flees back to Pakistan. In the FBI's investigation, they find smashed hard drives. They find this big transfer of money, like $280-some-thousand, if I remember the story you wrote, Mr. Rosiak. A bunch of money that's been transferred, and that ultimately is what they arrest Mr. Awan for on July 25th. They say it's bank fraud. And also part of this whole deal is they got this murky, kind of shady financial picture in their background, bankruptcy filings. They get a loan from this guy, if I remember this correct, this Dr. Al-Attar, is that right? Who's a fugitive on the run for tax and Medicaid fraud. And this doctor had been caught hanging around with known Hezbollah, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And now we're supposed to believe this is just theft? Is that what's going on? I mean, so look, you're a good reporter. You got to, for some reason, you decided, I'm going to investigate this when you saw, I think you said you saw a story in Politico, and you said, I'm going to investigate further. What's your gut instinct tell you? Is this just, maybe it is just theft, as Mr. Fenton said, but maybe it's something more. What's your instincts, what are your instincts telling you, Mr. Rosiak?
So over the years, everywhere these guys have gone, accusations of fraud have followed them. And the Democrats have said it's Islamophobia, but they have got numerous Muslims, their neighbors, even their own relatives, accusing them of various forms of fraud, and then sometimes threats, including violent threats, to try to suppress bad things from coming out. You also have the financial pressures of bankruptcy and these unexplained transfers from this Iranian fugitive. All of these are clearly red flags. Now you have the 5,000 unauthorized accesses to the House server, and we are told that that was Imran Awan's homework. I believe he has a daughter in elementary school. So this is terabytes of information that's said to have been going off the Congressional network, and no one's really disputing that that occurred. But what they're saying is that Imran Awan and his relatives broke into a House server, Xavier Becerra's server, in order to upload 1 terabyte of a 7-year-old's homework and then immediately re-download it. So when you couple that explanation with what we know about the background of these guys and how they've consistently lied on government forms and other things like that.
They got a shady background. They got bankruptcy filings in their past. They have at least somewhat of a relationship with a guy who's known to hang out with terrorists, right? And didn't they get a loan with this guy, this Dr. Al-Attar? Isn't there some loan arrangement between the Awans and Mr. Attar?
He gave them $100,000.
Yeah, so I mean, this at least cries out for a serious investigation when you got people who have money problems hanging out with and getting a loan from someone who is known to hang out with Hezbollah, and they have access to the server for dozens and dozens of Democrat elected officials in the United States Congress. I don't know, but that's a movie right there, I think, right? That's a movie. So, and yet we're having 6 guys show up to talk with 3 guys who've been following this story, and that's all the House is, to Mr. Fitton's point. Where in the heck is the House investigation? That's what I want to know.
And the name of the company they had was Cars Incorporated A, which is short for, which is obviously trolling in my view for CIA. I mean, all of these alarm bells should be going off for both the leadership here and national security officials in the executive branch, and I just fear that they're afraid to tread on because of political
and it gets
reasons.
even better because his wife was fleeing with a bunch of cash. She pulls her kids out of school that day and just up and goes. The husband gets caught a few months later at not just hanging out, going to work, not at the cars, whatever the name of the business, but at Dulles Airport trying to flee to Pakistan as well. And oh, by the way, he's just sent $280,000 to Pakistan in a fraudulent loan deal with the some Capitol Hill credit union, right?
Right, and their lawyer later acknowledged that at least some of those payments were made to a member of the Pakistani police force.
So it could be just like Mr. Fenton said. It could just be these are just good-for-nothing criminals, bad people, theft, lying, cheating, stealing. But it could be something bigger. And frankly, even if it's just the former, it's probably important we investigate and get the answers to those key questions. I thank you all for coming. I thank Congressman Gomer for putting this together.
Well, and something that came out in an article yesterday from our friend here, Luke Rosiak, and I did not see this till today, but his wife that seemed to be covering for him, that was allowed to leave with all the cash that she had after the alleged, the thing he's indicted for, the false information. They send all this cash they got from a loan, was in the indictment illegally. Now, this cohort, his wife, is now filing suit because he apparently married someone else in Pakistan, unbeknownst to her. Yeah. So anyway, that always creates an interesting
overlay.
You
need that element to make it a full-fledged movie. You need that element in the plot as well.
So it's just nonstop. And I said when we started, it's just something else all the time. And then this article from Forbes says Congressional IT aide, and this was yesterday, wiped his phone before being arrested. And anyway, it's just doesn't seem to cease. But I'd like to yield to my friend from Iowa.
Well, thank you, Mr. Gomer, and I'd like to thank all the witnesses for being here to testify today and to hear this, and my colleagues for taking an interest in this, and especially Louis Gomer for pulling this together. It's been something, a high item of frustration for a good number of us, but no one voiced it more quickly or more effectively or as early as Louis Gomer did. And so, but I appreciate the information that's been brought available to us, and otherwise, as I look out there, Democrats want to suppress it, and Republicans want to ignore it for the reasons I think that you said, Mr. Fitton, that they just simply don't want the controversy, and they're hoping that it goes away for fear of what they might discover. First, I want to just get some simple things out of the way. We've got 5 people here that are that are in this report that I have, and it's 4 family members and a friend. Are there others out there that may have not been identified that could have been affiliated? Do you know that, Mr. Rosiak?
I've used some computer algorithms to detect anyone that's likely to be associated, and I found 2 people, and I was right on both counts. I wasn't aware of other ones. The other 2 are Natalia Sova, who's Ukrainian-born wife of Abid, and she was dropped off the payroll a couple years ago, and that may be the reason you don't hear about her. The other one is a guy who, from my understanding, is like the patsy for these guys. He was the one who had to do all the work for employees who otherwise appeared to be no-show employees. So he was a guy who was a friend of theirs, and they basically worked him to the bone and paid him a fraction of what they made, and eventually he got fed up and he quit.
But both of these individuals would be of principal interest to an investigation that presumably is being done by justice.
Presumably.
Presumably. So I'm glad that you have those 2 names into the record. Of these, I'm going to call them 7 now, that Are there any of them that were natural-born citizens to the United States of America?
No.
And how many of them were naturalized citizens?
I know that the immediate family members were. I don't know about the Rao Abbas or Hasib Rana, who was the patsy.
Or the female from Ukraine?
I don't know about her.
That's some of the hardest information for a member of Congress to get, is what is the lawful status or the unlawful status of an individual. And so that's, Mr. Fitton, just as you were talking about, you were, I thought, fairly generous in the way that you painted the scenario. It said it could be as simple as, okay, but what about it could be as complex as? How far could you take that?
Well, you could have these individuals implicated in the infamous leak of the DNC emails. You could have a terrorist ring associated with these individuals. You could have a national security breach as a result of these individuals having access to sensitive or classified or confidential data here in the House. That would be the worst case scenario. And frankly, though, the best case scenario ain't all that great. You had a ongoing criminal enterprise being operated under the noses of 40 House members and the responsible administrative officials here in the House of Representatives. And put all of the details of this scandal aside, or the inflammatory details potentially aside. Where is the House, what is the House doing right now to make sure this isn't going on right now? Are they auditing personnel practices and administration policies to make sure that this soft underbelly in terms of personnel failures isn't ongoing in other instances? I don't see any evidence of that. I just see them, immediately they found something bad had happened, and they pawned it off on the FBI, who also went running for the hills.
So let me just paint a scenario a little bit broader than that. I mean, all these things could be as simple as, but it could be as complex as a very well synchronized and organized criminal enterprise that has his allegiance someplace other than to the United States of America, that has pulled out of this. We think, what is the top side, the amount of money that's been raked out of here? Does, Luke, do you know that
It
number?
was $7 million in, I believe, $6 million in salaries plus an unknown amount of equipment that was disappearing.
Okay, so round figures, maybe as much as $7 million. There's documentation for. So $7 million, and do we know how much of that may have gone to Pakistan?
It was certainly in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't know the exact amount.
But the rest of the money, then, if it didn't go to Pakistan and went to another country, or it's still in the United States, there should be some records of U.S. expenditures of these individuals.
So one of the first things that happened when this investigation came to people's attention is they had the FBI do a cursory run on these guys' names, and they found suspicious activity reports hundreds of pages long. These are generated when someone does something like deposit $9,999 in the bank or transfer money over overseas. So this is massive red flags. They owned 6 or 7 houses, and they were renting them out to people, and they would collect rent only in cash. So there's a lot of cash moving around. There's a consistent pattern of international wire transfers.
Could it be then, would it fit within the facts that this network could have been organized to launder money in the U.S. and then ship it to a destination like Pakistan?
Yes, and the car dealership that they operated, I'm not an expert in these things, but my understanding is that car dealerships are common fronts for money laundering.
I think we've got a case here perhaps of Islamophobia for sure, a fear to take them on rather than any kind of prejudice. The evidence is so heavy in all of this. And I haven't heard anybody publicly say that it could have been this, that it could have been a sophisticated network that was set up to draw as much money as possible from the U.S. taxpayers and ship it over to people that are enemies to our existence, perhaps. But I'd tie another piece of this then, and that is, if they had access to at least privileged information, if not classified information, I'm not convinced they didn't have access to classified information. We've watched the Hillary investigation far enough to know that the first answer is not the one that we should just accept blindly. But if they had access to privilege, perhaps classified, and this is information that was transferred through campaign computers, then connected with the chair of the DNC, then we can presume that a lot of that information was available to them. Now, this hacking of the DNC that reaches over to allegedly the Russians, but with WikiLeaks coming back with a bit of a different answer, and I compliment also Louis Gohmert and Dana Rohrabacher for looking into that particular question. But is it possible that this network that's here could have been connected to those incidents of the DNC hacking and perhaps the WikiLeaks information in a way other than just a random email that popped up?
I think that there is enough evidence of red flags here that that's something that should be explored. I've talked to a lot of people, and a lot of them have interesting things to say, and a lot of them have not been interviewed by the FBI. So there's reason to believe that the FBI is not talking to people that they should be, even basic people who could have knowledge of things like what you're talking about.
Mr. Fitton, what would your comment be on that question?
I am just aghast at the lack of urgency in getting these questions answered. Okay. I mean, the first I heard of this scandal, I immediately thought, well, this is a terrorist financing ring. You've got to make sure that's not happening. Evidently, they haven't run all those traps yet. And then, obviously, you get into the political espionage aspects or the national security aspects. They haven't run all those traps yet. I just cannot believe, given all the resources that we've spent over the last year or two about the mishandling of classified and sensitive data by top public officials, we would allow this group to run amok in the House, take all this data, move it around, and lack of interest from both House leadership and the executive branch officials responsible. There's a good reason the American people are upset about the way this has happened. This is going to blow up in the House's face if they don't get ahead of it and start taking it more seriously than they are.
Thank you, Mr. Fitton, and all the witnesses. I appreciate it, and I yield back to the Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. DeSantis, you were terrific today on Fox News. Yield to you.
Well, thank you for holding this hearing and for your interest and the other members' interest, and thanks to the witnesses. It was mentioned by Mr. Jordan that you know, maybe this is just kind of run-of-the-mill. They're just run-of-the-mill bad guys, and that explains their conduct, maybe not doing that. And I think that's definitely true. But what that wouldn't explain is the conduct of the members of Congress. I mean, what would be the rationale for a member of Congress paying a 20-year-old $160,000 to do nothing? I mean, has anyone offered an explanation in any of your investigations as to why someone would be able to do that? Were there other 20-year-olds making that kind of money in the House who had no skills to do anything? I mean, you're talking about, at a minimum, hundreds of thousands of dollars that were just frittered away. And yes, I know people sometimes are careless, but to me, that would have been done for a reason. Somebody would have done it for a reason. Have you uncovered any reasons why that would have been done?
That's a fantastic question. And as a reporter, when I was looking into this, as I said in my opening statement, I thought I was going to find rogue employees, and then the members were going to swiftly condemn them, and that was going to be that. And when I was calling around to these Democrats, they did one of two things. They went out of their way to not address it. I mean, literally run away from me physically. And then two, some of them would even defend them, which was unusual for a low-level staffer. So you have members who were employing the guy that worked at McDonald's, members like Ted Deutsch of Florida and Emmanuel Cleaver, and they employed this guy, and I said, have you ever seen him? And they wouldn't say, and I asked them again and again, have you ever seen your own IT guy? It's a pretty simple question, and they wouldn't say. So the answers for why they would do that, I think, there's two possibilities. The first is that they fear that their information could be released if they do not do what these guys say. These guys have had access to a lot of information. It doesn't have to be classified. It could be politically embarrassing, like the DNC. This is a possibility that needs to be looked into, given that numerous relatives of theirs, as well as business associates in the real estate businesses they were doing, have have described behavior that basically amounts to extortion. So there's reason to think that these guys are the kind of people who might do that. And you hear again and again these stories of basically bullying and trying to get money out of people and threatening. The other one is a kickback scheme. So this is the kind of thing, and I think the check kiting scandal, the House banking scandal back in the 90s is the exact right example. So when we're talking about were members sharing the proceeds of this ghost employee scheme and this disappearing equipment, the best evidence for that, or one piece of evidence, comes from Imram's own lawyers. Their official position now is that members instructed these guys to falsify the invoices. So you got to take that with a grain of salt. I mean, this is coming from a criminal defense attorney for a guy who's trying to get out of trouble, but he hasn't been charged with it, neither have members, and yet these invoices, for 18 months now, they've had these invoices that were falsely stating the value of equipment in such a way that it didn't appear in the House inventory. So if members were sharing in the proceeds of a kickback scheme, and that could be a chief of staff or another high-level official in these offices, that could be a reason why members don't want these guys investigated and may even go so far as to look the other way at a potential national security or cybersecurity breach because they know that this investigation is part and parcel of a kickbacks thing, or rather a procurement issue, which could implicate members.
And I think that those answers are all potentially readily attainable with either discussions with Awan himself in exchange for potential plea agreement, the wife plea agreement. My concern is, I mean, you know, the wife goes, she's got 14 grand in cash, she's allowed to leave the country. You know, a lot of my constituents, I mean, if they have an administrative violation, they'll have OSHA sweep in, all these agencies. It's just weird that she would be allowed to go. And I'm just concerned that, you know, we have a Justice Department, FBI, we have certain laws, but the ferocity of which those laws are enforced has just not been uniform lately. I mean, you know, you look at the Mueller investigation, picking Manafort's lock in the middle of the night, drawing guns on him and his wife for some white-collar infraction 3-4 years ago. I mean, that's like scorching the earth, but yet with Hillary, she was exonerated 2 months before, Comey exonerated her 2 months before she was brought in for questioning. And my fear on this case is that the ferocity will not be where it needs to be, because I think if you do, I think on the FBI and U.S. Attorney DOJ side, I think you can get answers to these questions, and I think you can break it open. I have not seen that as of yet. I mean, have any of the witnesses seen leaks about the investigation? I mean, we see all these other leaks, as have people been saying things are happening. The initial indictment was very bare bones. Usually when they're doing, the DOJ does cases, and particularly involving potential public corruption, you know, they usually really fluff out the indictments. Now, maybe that was just a placeholder that they're then going to supersede, and I think they probably will do that. But it just causes me concern. I mean, if it's investigated rigorously and the pieces just don't fit and the evidence isn't there, fine. But you could easily make an investigative decision to just not really deal with the members of Congress and their conduct, and I think that would really be unfortunate. So that is, I think, one of the worries. In terms of the House, I mean, at some point you have to stand up for your institution. Are you just totally feckless, or are you actually wanting to get answers? Mr. Fitton, your Judicial Watch, you guys are involved in all this. How many subpoenas or hearings did the House of Representatives hold last Congress about the Clinton Foundation scandal?
I'm not aware of any, and if they came up, I'm sure it was by accident. 0 hearings.
Yep. Not one hearing. Now, when you had the Clinton cash break, I mean, you have massive amounts of money going to the foundation, money going to Bill Clinton personally, State Department taking any action. Look, maybe it was all innocent and just coincidental, but it cried out for an investigation. I mean, that's our job, to conduct oversight, and yet the leadership of this body just said that we can't do that for whatever reasons that they had. And so guys like me who wanted to do it, we were told we're not allowing you to go into that. Incidentally, I mean, as soon as this president got elected, the leadership all authorized investigations about Russia, which I'm still waiting for the evidence of collusion there. With the Clintons, you knew what you were investigating. So what does Congress need to do to get its act together, because we've just ceded so much of our power to conduct oversight. The IRS is a good example, how Koskinen was allowed to skate, Lois Lerner. You guys get more information than we do, but I mean, what could we do in this case specifically, but then obviously just broader?
Well, there's this general issue. The founders thought the legislative branch would necessarily predominate in our Republican form of government. And the legislative branch is AWOL in terms of oversight, and they don't want to oversee the executive branch, and obviously they don't want to look internally. They can enforce subpoenas, they can arrest people for contempt, all sorts of powers available to them under the Constitution they refuse to exercise. And in this case, they don't have to wait for the Justice Department to figure out what members are up to. You have a House ethics process that can figure that out. You have an IG process that can help figure that out. So you have every tool available to you. It's not like this is behind a wall over which you cannot travel to get the information. You can institute a House ethics process here, bring the members in, and the members could refuse to cooperate, and that will tell you something. But many members will cooperate and give you the answers about why these individuals were given as much money they were, what broke down. And, to be fair to the Democrats, maybe there wasn't sufficient oversight. No one knew what was going on. They understood that they were these guys. They were seemingly doing competent work on IT. It wasn't a big issue for them, and they were able just to game the system, and they were victims in some ways. They're certainly not acting like victims, but it may be politicians tend to act guilty even if they're not sometimes. But these are questions that need to be answered, and if the Justice Department is going to do it, and not going to do it, the FBI is going to do it, the House has an obligation to do it. This is why people want this. This is what they talk about, the American people do, when they say drain the swamp. There's a swamp here in Congress, and this is Exhibit A.
Well, thank you, and I'll yield back to Mr. Gohmert.
Well, thank you. And we got more questions if y'all got the time. In fact, question was raised earlier about background security checks. More recently, a system has been put in place that requires any IT worker to either have a background check, or if that individual works for more than one office, then the other members can sign saying this person's already had a background check through another office that we're working part-time for, and that would prevent a need for a background check every time somebody's already had one gets one. But do we know, Mr. Rosiak, whether or not there was any background check ever done on Imran Awan?
I'm not aware of there being one, and my understanding is that if he were a private company as a contractor, he would have been subject to additional scrutiny. So perhaps that's why he structured it as they're all individual W-2 employees, which is the case. These are individuals who work for one member, so they're not allowed to share job duties, and yet that is what they appear to be doing.
Could you share if a background check of Imran Awan had been done, what, in your opinion, would have raised red flags that this person should not be allowed to work in this system?
Well, 4 women have now accused him of abusing them or doing violent threats, and those include his own stepmother, a second wife who said, and I can read...
But he was not in the film business, right? But he was abusing women, right?
That's correct, and members have not disavowed this guy, despite quotes like, this is from a police report in Fairfax County, Virginia. A woman called and said her, quote, boyfriend treat her bad and keep her there like a slave, and she's referring to Imran Awan. And there's a number of examples like that. The stepmother said that he basically used his congressional, he said, the stepmother said he is, quote, very powerful and introduced himself as a federal agent. So basically what he appears to have been doing is misrepresenting his authority as a government official to immigrants. And you can see how if you're not from this country, you don't know what it means to be a congressional employee or a congressional IT guy. You just know you have some authority. And he threatened to kidnap that woman according to court documents. So background checks of the other guys, the brother had a couple of criminal encounters for things like DUIs right around the time he got hired, which would be like just weeks before he got fired. Originally hired, he was, booked on a driving offense, that kind of thing would come up. But the big thing is the finances. He had huge debts. He filed bankruptcy, and at that time he had almost $1 million in debt. And he was working for members of the Intelligence Committee at that time. So when someone has a lot of debts, that's the big red flag that a background check would capture.
Well, in fact, there was someone, wasn't it, maybe it was the doctor that loaned $100,000 that ended up on the house payroll?
So this car dealership, this is a quote from a court document, and they say all this stuff about, oh, it's, some kind of fake news or it's a conspiracy. And it's true that some people out there on the internet say some crazy stuff, but everyone knows that's what the internet does. Every single thing I've reported has come from, court documents, et cetera. And this is a quote from a lawsuit in Fairfax County. Their business partner, who happens to be Muslim, recounted how they received $100,000 from, quote, Ali al-Attar, who was out of the country as he was involved in politics and the formation of the Iraqi government.
Now, is that the guy that had known ties, or ties with known
and so
individuals
the Department of Justice
with
confirmed to
Hezbollah?
me that he is currently a fugitive wanted by the DOJ.
This Dr. Attar?
Dr. Attar.
Yeah.
And so this Muslim business partner of theirs says it was very bad record keeping in Cars International. It's close to impossible to make any sense out of all the transactions that happened. So you've got this car dealership, and if you go on their Facebook page, they're using stock images for their supposed employees. So there are indications that this car dealership was not exactly a typical car dealership, and this all occurred while the manager of it was Awan, who was making $160,000 for House Democrats, which when you're making that kind of money, you kind of assume it's full-time work.
So did Dr. Attar end up on the House payroll?
No, oh, sorry, I forgot to address that point. So they're in all kinds of financial disputes all the time. And when Abid filed bankruptcy, he said that he owed a lot of money to this guy, Raul Abbas. And I believe it was right after that time that Raul Abbas starts getting paid by the House. So it, implies maybe he was using taxpayer money to pay off personal debts. But at the end of the day, obviously, Imran Awan did not have or should not have had the ability to put people on the payroll. At the end of the day, it's members or chiefs of staff who are signing these paychecks. And the same thing goes for these purchase orders. They may have been filling them out with the fraudulent number of $499 for all this equipment. But at the end of the day, someone in one of these congressional offices was signing off on that.
Well, and you brought that up before about the voucher fraud scheme, but it may well be that members of the House that were just totally relying on what the Awans represented as the value of what they were purchasing. But I understand from your reporting that they were actually, because you do not have to put something in inventory here in the House if it's less than $500, then Imran Awan and his cohorts would list things that cost more than $500, like iPads for $800 or so, would list them for just under $500, and then put a warranty that costs more than that. Is that your understanding?
Correct.
And Mr. Towers, you nodding. Is that what?
I read the same thing.
But you understand how that could happen. You, as an IT guy, you make recommendations of things that should be purchased, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, the House policy is anything that's under $500 can be purchased and reimbursed on a voucher, or if anything over $500 would require to go through the House purchasing process where there is oversight.
Well, as someone, I will disclose, there was in my office in the 1980s, a congressman predecessor who purchased a typewriter, and we have not still, well, I guess the typewriter took about a year before we were allowed to finally write it off. We don't know, we didn't have a typewriter when I came into office. We don't know where that typewriter is, but it took over a year of working back and forth with the House admin to get them to allow us to write off that typewriter that no telling how many years, 20, 25, that has not been around. I'm sure it doesn't work if somebody could find it, but it certainly wasn't on hand when I came on board. And we still have a couch that was purchased in 1976 that we have not been allowed to write off, and nobody knows. Somewhere in the last decades, that couch disappeared before I came in, and we've not been allowed to write it off yet. So I read with interest that a member could write off $120,000 for inventory that couldn't be found. Could you expand on that?
So in February of 2016, Yvette Clark got a new chief of staff, and shortly after that time, they filed a write-off request to remove $120,000 of equipment that couldn't be found to get that off the inventory. So this is a tenth of their annual budget. They've got 15 staffers there, so that's like enough for 150 iPads in an office with 15 employees. And they encounter this problem. The new chief of staff realizes it, and they write it off, and they take no action. They don't fire Abita One, who was their IT guy at the time. And months go by, and they haven't alerted authorities or anything. They've just written it off. And eventually, House administrators learn independently about problems with this guy, and they tell all the members, we're going to start looking into everything associated with this. And it wasn't until that time that Yvette Clark told anyone about the $120,000 of missing equipment.
Well, and I understand there was one member of Congress that fired Imran Awan within a matter of months for incompetence. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
Who was that?
Kristen Sinema.
Yeah. And so she saw the work that was being done by Imran Awan and fired him for incompetence. Isn't that the reason that was given?
Yes.
Was that listed somewhere as the reason?
She was one of the few members who has said anything about these guys. I sent to the 17 female members who employed these guys. I sent them the police reports where these members these females are alleging abuse, including, quote, being kept like a slave. And Kristen Sinema was one of only 2 members who responded. The other 15 female Democrats declined to criticize Imran Awan, even despite these mounting red flags and accusations coming from, fellow Muslims and coming from, all kinds of different places.
Yeah. Well, the issue, everybody's familiar with the alleged hacking by the Russians, and I was shocked in the prior administration that anybody from our own intelligence or law enforcement like the FBI could insist that the hacking was done by Russia when they were never allowed to review the DNC server. But you and I have talked briefly before, and I was, you had mentioned information coming forward that when the amount of information that was hacked by someone is reviewed, and you consider it in light of the speed, the maximum speed you could download information through the internet, that apparently there is no way anyone, including Russia, could have downloaded all the information that was hacked. Isn't that correct?
I've seen those reports suggesting that the transfer was local rather than over the internet.
Which would mean more likely somebody uses a thumb drive or a hard drive to transfer it over to, something like that. They would get the speed in order to get all of the information downloaded that apparently was hacked and provided to WikiLeaks, correct? Isn't that what the allegation is? We don't know at this point, though, whether Imran Awan had access to the DNC server, do we?
Correct.
Go ahead.
It seems to me that should be a question that's asked in the investigation, right? I mean, what Representative Gohmert is discussing here regarding the speed is this Intel Vets Challenge Russia hack evidence, which is reported right here, that the speed is incongruent with doing it online. It had to be done physically through a thumb drive or I imagine servers hooked up together through wires. It wasn't going to happen through the ether. And while we're trying to figure out, while the government is spending untold amounts of money, energy, and time determining whether the Russians did this hack and what the collusion is and with the Trump administration, et cetera. It seems to me a simple questioning of Mr. Awan in that regard would reveal whether he was can be implicated or not. I mean, I find it very curious. Let me ask Pat this. This Dropbox, it's a 30-party data collector, right, and storage.
Correct.
Right? So that's not authorized for the House of Representatives, is it?
In fact, I verified again today on the House. It is an unauthorized software. The statement on the House.
Is your mic on?
I'm sorry. The statement on the House network says that it's an unauthorized software, and the House is not willing to accept responsibility for the vulnerabilities it creates.
And what are those vulnerabilities?
The fact that it's a free software that's available over the internet could be exploited by many different means. Correct.
And it could be that members' information is on there, but it could be also that other information is on there. We don't know the extent of it until Mr. Awan, I guess, is deposed in that regard,
Correct.
and somebody asks those questions. But we don't even know if they're headed in that direction. And while it might be, as Mr. Jordan and Mr. DeSantis alluded to, just crooks and thieves and bad guys doing bad things for money, the fact that you would take the time and the energy to transfer how much is a terabyte?
A lot.
Well, is it what your child? I have 2 children, right?
Yes.
That write up cards and notes to me, and it's in English that only they and their parents understand, the spelling and so on and so forth. But
a single email is a few, I would say, a few gigabytes, and
I don't know if that's going to give anybody the scale of what a terabyte is.
A piece of paper would be equal to an email. A stack of paper the size of this table would be a terabyte.
Okay.
So if an image, they mentioned it was homework and family photos. If a family, I believe it would be something like 85 million pages of a child book report. And if it was family photos, I believe it would be 250,000 photos.
So that's a pretty prolific homework assignments, it sounds like. But so what is your motivation if you're Awan and you've got this scheme to defraud the American taxpayer of $6-7 million through ghost employees? Whether some of that money is being returned to parties that have approved it or not. I mean, it seems to me that many of the members were just victims here. I don't know, but that's plausible as well. But what is your impetus for collecting terabytes of information, moving them off-site, and providing yourself over time with access to them, even when you're denied access after having been found out? What is the motivation for doing that?
There is no foreseeable legitimate reason to do that.
Yeah, they're all illegitimate. We just don't know what they could be. It could be extortion, or it could be otherwise, right?
I wouldn't want to speculate.
Could be the sale of data.
Absolutely, it could have been.
Right. So, but the bottom line is we don't know where the investigation stands. Is the House still investigating or not? Does anybody know?
I haven't seen any indication that the House is.
I mean, I don't mean the committees. I'm sorry, the Sergeant at Arms or Capitol Police.
I think they've turned it over to.
So, as far as we know, it's all in the FBI's hands right now.
I believe the Capitol Police are running the investigation, and the FBI is providing assistance.
All right. So, but the House of Representatives isn't doing any investigation. And with I find it curious the claim that the Department of Justice is loath to or concerned about maybe the perception or what have you of including and implicating members of Congress in an investigation regarding bank fraud and maybe misappropriation of funds unwittingly, if it were. But they don't seem to have a problem taking on the President of the United States with almost nary a shred of evidence. I find that somewhat not congruent. Do you see any?
Yeah, you're exactly right, and you have to wonder if this is a partisan decision on the part of bureaucrats in the Justice Department to protect the Democratic Party. There's been that general concern for years now with the Justice Department. And if there was a serious investigation, in theory, you're not supposed to know about it.
Right.
But if they're talking to House members and you're involving politicians, it's like telling a bunch of third graders what you're up to. It's going to come out. And we see no indication that there's any serious investigation because we hear about it. You'd see grand jury activity. You get leaks about members or staff having to talk to the FBI and such, and or even to the Capitol Hill Police, and we see no indication that's going on. which makes me think this is a Potemkin investigation.
No indication of potential witnesses with information or oblique ties to the allegations being interviewed in any sense or form, right? That's what you're talking about. We would know that,
You have
right?
40 offices who might have information and might be witnesses one way or another.
And none of them are being talked to as far as you know.
You would hear about it if that were the case. It'd be the most significant, it'd be remarkable if they kept it quiet. And so I don't believe it's being kept quiet. I just believe nothing's being done.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Well, one of the concerns had been piqued by reporting. Of course, we all know that we have official mail. Everybody that works in the House, the last part of our address is at mail.house.gov. And in a small claims court case in Virginia, it appears someone was suing Imran Awan for a small amount of money. And in the section of the filing that requires the plaintiff to certify that the other party is not an active member of the military, the plaintiff notes that Imran, quote, works for the House of Representatives, and his email address is 123@mail.house.gov. Mr. Rosiak, you found these documents. How did you find these?
Well, a renter, he owns all these houses, and someone told me that he used 123 and showed me emails. And then I also...
renter from Imran Awan.
Yeah, Imran Awan was the landlord, and he was using this address, and then I saw it a second time in court records, as you mentioned. And when I typed in this email address, it auto-completed a name, and that name was the Deputy Chief of Staff for Andre Carson, who's a member of the Intelligence Committee. So there's 10,000 Capitol Hill staffers here. Not many of them do anything involving intelligence. And this name was somehow connected to what we know was Imran's address. So I went to Andre Carson's office, and first of all, this address was still accepting email. It had not been shut down. So my impression was that investigators promptly shut down imram.awan at mail.house.gov, but they didn't know about this other thing. So here you have a link to an intelligence specialist here on the Hill. You have a secret email address. And I go to the relevant member and his office, and I told them about the court documents, et cetera, and they didn't express any concern. I have no indication that they took any steps to have this shut down. Instead, he went on local media and blamed Islamophobia and made quotes that suggested that he only reluctantly fired Imran Awan, despite this evidence suggesting that this guy who's indicted may have stolen the identity of an intelligence staffer. So this was one of the moments in the story in which I realized these Democrats' reaction is not at all what you would expect when you have, because things can, there are bad people out there. Anyone could accidentally hire a bad person. But the reaction that I got from Democrats and that Andre Carson thing is a great example was just completely different than what I would have expected.
Well, did you bring it to CAO's attention?
The CAO has refused to talk to me about this story. The silence in all of this I think is pretty interesting. It's also worth noting that if you read the Washington Post story last month, it says that the House leadership got together, and it appears to be talking about Paul Ryan and Nancy Pelosi. Before the election, they knew about these thousands of accesses to this server. They knew about it before the election, and both parties, the leadership from both parties, made the decision to sit on it until after the election. And then after the election, both parties in the House Administration Committee made a pact not to speak about it. And then you have members who are making statements, Democratic members, that are inconsistent with the basic facts. And the reason they've been able to do so, and people haven't realized what's going on here, is because there have been no official statements about this. So some members have claimed, I asked, well, after the security breach involving this Becerra server, what did you do to your data? And they said, I didn't do anything to my data because I was never told there was a breach. So if that's true, that's a big problem, that these members weren't even told about the breach. And if they're not being accurate in their statements, that's obviously a problem as well.
Well, I want to, I know that it's been reported and some have claimed that, gee, this is nothing but just a simple bank fraud case, if it's that. But under 18 U.S.C. section 101001, says whoever in any manner within the jurisdiction of the government, which of course includes House employees, knowingly and willfully falsifies, conceals, or covers up by any trick, scheme, or device a material fact makes any materially false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement or representation, or 3, makes or uses any false writing or document knowing the same contain any materially false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement or entry, shall be fined under this title, imprisoned not more than 5 years, or if the offense involves international or domestic terrorism, imprisoned not more than 8 years, or both. With respect to the situation with the Awan family and associates, it appears that there have been falsified vouchers that Awan and his family and associates have filed many times. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
So when Imran Awan and his associates acted as ghost employees where they, as you were saying earlier, when they achieved the maximum amount that a house employee can make, then you seem to indicate that's when another family member, another associate would pop up and would find themselves on the payroll, correct?
Correct.
And do we know for sure if some of those family and associates did not ever perform IT work for these offices?
Well, there are indications. For example, the youngest brother was a full-time college student. He was only 20 years old. Imran Awan spends months out of every year in Pakistan. Abid was supposedly...
He spent at least 1 month a year in Pakistan.
He spent more like, I've seen records indicating that he spent like 3 to even more months per year in Pakistan.
Some years he would spend more than 3 months in Pakistan.
He also, I have seen emails where he indicated that he was doing his job remotely from Pakistan.
So he had access and doing the job of providing security for house members from Pakistan? Seriously?
That's what he said.
I had not seen that anywhere. I was not aware of that. But Imran Awan himself said he was helping with, well, he was doing the job for which he was being paid. What amount was he being paid annually?
Over $160,000.
Over $160,000 annually, and some years more than 3 months doing it from Pakistan. That is just staggering. Well, and there is another part of 18 U.S.C. Section 1001, and that's C, with respect to any matter within the jurisdiction of legislative branch, subsection A, which was the part I read a moment ago, shall apply only to administrative matters, including a claim for payment or a matter related to procurement of property or services, personnel, employment practices, or support services, or a document required by law, rule, or regulation to be submitted to the Congress or any office or officer within the legislative branch, or any investigation or review conducted pursuant to the authority of any committee, subcommittee, commission, or office of the Congress. I mean, though some people want to say this is just a bank fraud, simple one-time bank fraud case, there's all kinds. It seems like there may be hundreds and hundreds of criminal violations under that provision alone. Would you agree?
That's correct. And the bank fraud was not even learned about, or may not have even occurred until after these guys became aware that they were subjects of the cybersecurity and procurement. That has always been what this is about. So at the end of 2016 into the beginning of 2017, they realized that, you know, someone's on to them, and they start moving all this money over to Pakistan, and they fly over there. So you could say that they were charged with what appears to be the flight or the cover-up rather than the underlying crime. Now, I think a really important point here is that the chief administrative officer of the House is in possession of all these invoices, which are indisputably falsified. It doesn't need an investigation. It's been over 18 months, but the fact is these invoices say that equipment cost $499 when it did not. And yet no one has been held accountable for those procurement issues.
Well, so where did all this equipment go? Do you know?
So I have multiple of their relatives telling me that they were sending iPhones and other similar equipment to Pakistan. I heard about that months ago before I heard about the issues with the disappearing equipment, and I didn't report it because I didn't really feel like I had enough corroborating it. But over time, I heard multiple people tell me that. These relatives have always been right with what they've told me. And then when I heard about the missing equipment, it all kind of added up. So there are indications that he was selling it in Pakistan, according to his own relatives. Now, I also was told an interesting...
So his own relatives were saying Imran Awan was sending equipment purchased with house money to Pakistan and selling it over in Pakistan.
They didn't tell me that it was house equipment. They just told me that he was sending a large number of iPhones over to Pakistan.
iPhones, any iPads, things like that?
I believe it was a variety of equipment. And then the other thing is that the House was aware of this so for 18 months now they've had that, and there's also the issue of ethics disclosures. I mean, if you make a lot of money in the House, and also if you're a shared employee, you have to file these ethics disclosures. And there are numerous false statements on these ethics disclosures. It's a felony every time you do it, and they haven't been charged with it. So you've got...
Yeah, we have to list all outside income.
Yeah. And they were really obvious lies. Like, it asked you, did your spouse have income? And so they say, my spouse had no income. Well, in some cases, the spouse was employed by the House of Representatives itself. So they're submitting it to whatever body in the House reviews these things. They don't catch it. And then later on, there's all this scrutiny on these guys. It's known misstatements on these, and nothing happens. So the House has these procurement rules, and they have these ethics rules. But then 18 months later, after it's clear that violations took place, no one is held accountable. So it's a really interesting case of, if you're going to have rules and you're not going to enforce them, I mean, why have them at all?
Congressman,
yes, sure.
If I could just interject, this is disturbing information in the sense that we all know that One brothers aren't brilliant. You know, they're criminal. The criminals are criminals. They don't come up with unique ideas. And you can bet in a government agency or congressional system where you have 20,000 employees, they're not the only ones who have figured out how to game the system. And the question I have is, what are the administrative leaders of the House doing to make sure this isn't going on again? Are they performing an audit of the payroll or the procurement system? I mean, procurement fraud is an ongoing problem government-wide. And the House of Representatives seems to think that it's immune from it, and it doesn't need to do any policing, beyond the in-your-face allegations that we probably wouldn't know about, but for the reporting of Luke. I mean, let's be clear here. We don't know about this because of voluntary disclosures by the United States government or Congress. This is because of intrepid reporting by one investigative reporter at the Daily Caller News Foundation. Judicial Watch hasn't been able to get anything. We've asked under the Freedom of Information Act, the relevant agencies, but they're going to they've thrown back the law enforcement privileges. So we're getting the stone wall. This information is coming out of reporting. Why isn't Congress disclosing this to the American people and undertaking a further investigation to make sure others aren't engaging in this type of activity?
Well, I got to tell you, I never dreamed that we were having any problem with people putting individuals on their payroll without realizing they weren't going to be doing the work. It just didn't cross my mind that that might be going on. And it's not to say that any member of Congress did so illegally, but, just lied to.
Well, now we know there's a problem, and
now we
you
know
take
there's
steps
a problem
to further understand it and address it if necessary.
Well, let me ask, when Imran Awan provided Capitol Police with turned out to be a false copy of Congressman Becerra's server, apparently it was to conceal the fact that he had other members' data stored on the real Becerra server. Is that your understanding?
Right. I mean, there was a cover-up. So when the Washington Post says that it was just homework, well, why did you take the remarkable step of providing a false image if you were just covering up your kid's homework?
But that's another crime in and of itself. If a law enforcement agency asks for a piece of evidence and you provide it and represent this is the piece of evidence you asked for, knowing that it is not, which he had to have known. He made the copy, apparently. that's another crime. If that is what happened, and all the reporting seems to be that's exactly what it was. Well, y'all have all provided a tremendous amount of information and also raised a lot of questions that for which we still need answers. But it does alert us to our own vulnerability. And hopefully by your being at this meeting today, the Tax Enough Already caucus, and providing the answers and asking the questions you have, hopefully we'll find motivation anew here in the House to really get to the bottom of this. It's clearly more than one simple transaction of bank fraud. Right. So I know you took time from your busy schedules, and again emphasize, Pat Sowers, you were here in your individual capacity, not on behalf of any office, but we really appreciate the insight you provided from an IT professional. Luke, you're an amazing investigative reporter. We appreciate your information and your resilience as a reporter. Tom Fitton, if it weren't for Judicial Watch, we wouldn't have so much of the information about prior improprieties that we do. Thank you for the efforts that Judicial Watch makes and for all the good that it does in shining a light of day in problems. Thank you. We are now concluding this meeting.